Okay, welcome class. Accounting 320, Fraud Detection and Deterrence. I'm your host, Dr. B. This is, we are currently in the 5th week of our course. We made it through halfway, so yay, that's wonderful. We are well on our way to finishing our course. After this Zoom session, we'll have one more in week 7. In this session, I would like to cover this week and next week through a review of what's coming up, and we'll also cover a little bit of content as well. So first and foremost, we're looking at our class home screen. I want to point out a couple of key items that I think you'll find very, very important for your project and the discussion for this week. So if you navigate to content and you come on down to e-reserves, the e-reserves, I have included 2 additional resources that I found I believe will be extremely helpful when it comes to your project and your discussion for this week. The first one I want to point out is planning and conducting a fraud examination. And so this resource was provided to us by the ACCT, which is one of our primary resources for this course. And this document, it's very long, as you can see. This is the Fraud Examiner's Manual 2020 edition, and this is section 3. In section 3, the manual goes over why conducting a fraud examination, what's included. It's really a great resource for your project, and I think that you'll find it very helpful to that regard. The other resource I find to be extremely helpful is this Fraud Detection in Organizations for Using Forensic Accounting and Data Mining Techniques. This is, again, another ACCT product. This article, it's a little dated, it's 2014, but it's still extremely useful for today's environment. It's based off of Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. As you know from your previous courses in your coursework, Sarbanes-Oxley Act was designed and developed for the protection of investors, to create transparency for financial reporting. And there is a section within Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is section number 99, which has a direct implication when it comes to preventing fraud. And so I believe that this document will also be extremely helpful for your project and for our discussion in week 5. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in our presentation for today. So those are the 2 latest resources I found for you that I believe will be extremely helpful for the completion of your project. Now let's hop into week 5 real quick in the classroom. I would want to highlight a couple of items for this week. First and foremost is the week 5 fraud detection and deterrence planning discussion. So this discussion asks us to locate a learning resource, how it assists us in concerning the application of fraud detection and deterrence procedures. The materials in the classroom are okay. They're not the greatest. Which is why I think that when it comes to the planning, I strongly believe that this resource, the Planning and Conducting Fraud Examination in the 2020 Fraud Examiner's Manual, will be most useful, not just for that discussion, but also for your project. COSO has a great framework when it comes to conducting fraud examination and planning. And that is something that I think would also be of relevance. So if you go back to your week 5 and you open up the reading list, these are pretty good resources. As you can see, there are a few when it comes to modeling and things like that, but there's not a ton around planning, with the exception of the COSO internal controls components article. That one is probably going to be the best for that discussion. But in addition to that, I would strongly recommend the 2 that I had just added under e-reserves, especially this one for planning. So that is the discussion. And then the most important component for this week is the case presentation. The case presentation is the first of 3 parts of the course project. In this case presentation, you will be developing your own case. You will not be finding a case from the internet like you've been doing for your current reports. This is different. This is very different from your current reports type of stuff. This is not a real case. This is something that you're going to make up. And we'll talk about that in the presentation, but I just want you to be aware that this is the first part of a 3-part project that you're working on in this course. And then we'll also talk about what's happening in the next week. And so that's week 5. And week 6, which is the following week. In this week, you will have a PowerPoint peer review. So in addition to your writing for your project, you'll be crafting a PowerPoint presentation. And your colleagues in your class, your classmates, will have the opportunity to critique your PowerPoint and provide you with some pointers and things like that in areas for improvement. It's designed to be just, it's not like a penalization or something like that. The peer review process is really designed to help you to become a good presenter, right? Especially on a case that you're designing. And then there are the other 2 components of the 3-part project will also be due at the end of week 6. So we have a very busy month ahead of us. And so that's why it's important that we are proactive in our approach and that we try to get started right away. So let's go ahead and jump into our presentation. And please, again, feel free to ask questions along the way. And I'll probably ask a few questions of you all as well, just so we are all on the same page. Be nice and fun, promise. I try to make learning as fun and interactive as possible, which is why I host these optional sessions. And I like to get to know you guys. Okay. So let's talk about the project. There are really 4 components to this project, 3 of which include your draft, your writing. And there's a PowerPoint that you'll develop and will be critiqued by your peers. And the PowerPoint, think of it like a draft, right? It's a draft. We're drafting these components, and at I believe it's week 7 and 8, you'll actually be submitting them, your final version, right, for grading. So as you go through this process, I want you to be in the mind of a CFE, a certified fraud examiner. I want you to get into that mindset. Think of yourself as a CFE, you're putting yourself in that role, okay? And you are going to create a case, and then you're going to go through the process of investigating and determining what happened, how to prevent that from happening again, that type of thing. And then the PowerPoint presentation will help you to present the case to your colleagues, and it's kind of like you're presenting your findings, what happened, how it happened, how to prevent it, that type of stuff, right? So it's similar to your current event cases where you've been reading, analyzing, and providing an opinion. The only difference here is that instead of finding a case online, you're actually going to develop your own case. And so let's talk a little bit more about that through the case presentation. We're going to create a case. So, and you can find all of this information, and let me just show you where it's located in the classroom. If you go to syllabus and you go to ACCT 320 project descriptions, if you open that up, you will be able to see how the project is formulated. So if you come down, you see this thing that says 3-part assignment. The first is the case presentation, the second is the investigative project design, and the third is the deterrence measure design. What we're going over right now is the case presentation. This is the exact text that I took from here, and I'm going to walk through it in detail so that way you understand exactly what it is that you need to do for this project. So the case presentation, so what you're going to be doing here is you're going to draft a case describing a type of fraud that is consistent with one of the many types of fraud that we've discussed in the class so far. This is larceny, asset misappropriation, cash skimming. There's a ton of other ones that we talked about. In this case draft, you are not going on the internet and finding a case. That's not what we're doing here. You're going to create your own case. So for example, let's say that you are an investigator and you came across the case. The case is a third, let's think of something creative. Subject went to a gas station, and at the gas station pump, they inserted a small chip device into the gas pump in the credit card reader. And the device is known as a skimmer. The skimmer reads the credit card information and transmits it wirelessly from the device to the subject's personal computer. The subject is at their home printing off these credit card numbers and information to then sell on a third-party, what they call a backdoor web page where cyber criminals buy and sell credit card data. And through that fraud that was perpetrated through the gas pump, $1.2 million of credit card data was taken and sold to other criminals for use. So that's the case data, right? You're just making it up, okay? It's purely made up, but that is something that probably does happen all the time, okay? In fact, you can go online and do some research and find things like that have happened, and then just create your own data, okay? Create a case. This is what the case presentation is. You are creating a fictitious case that sounds real, okay? That is based on a type of fraud like credit card skimming, okay, that you just created a scenario for it. Like that was the scenario. The subject went to a gas station. The subject put a device in the credit card reader in the on the gas pump. When you insert your credit card and pull it out of the gas pump, it's transmitting data to an end user who is then selling that data. Okay, that's the scenario. Okay, and then so what's related to that scenario? Okay, so we know what happened. A device was implanted on a gas pump. The data was transmitted to end users. The data was then sold on the dark web. The people on the dark web who purchased the information probably used those credit card numbers to make purchases. That's the scenario, okay? And we know the facts behind it. So we know what happened. Now, what was the fraud? The fraud was credit card skimming, okay? Okay, great. So we know how the fraud was perpetrated. Now, what else do we need to do? We need to think about the logistics of what happened. How do we go about the prosecution? How do we go about the detection, right? How do we find out about the skimmer? Like, let's say you're the gas station owner, somebody did that to you. How'd you find out that the skimmer was there? Did you use some type of magnetic device to find it? I don't know. But the point of this process, this case presentation, is you want to create a case, something like that. You know, it could be anything, really. It could be, you've read the cases. We know that there's so many different types of fraud that happen on a daily basis. We know that. So based off of what you read, create a fictitious case, pick a specific fraud that you are interested in and studying, okay? Whether it be scamming or whether it be, loan fraud, like the PPE stuff that happened recently with the COVID, or the Paycheck Protection Program frauds that happened with COVID, or whatever, right? Just pick one that you're interested in, whether it be bank fraud, whether it be physical asset fraud. Like, for example, the company bought all these laptops. They never put them into inventory, wound up in somebody's trunk, that type of stuff. Make something up, but make sure it's something that you're interested in, because you're going to use this for the rest of the project, okay? So think of this as the foundation for the project. You write up your draft case, what the problem is, what was the fraud, who was involved, right? You're basically creating the timeline for the case, right? And so it should just be a couple of paragraphs, maybe about a page in length for the case presentation, single spaced, of course, about a page in length. And it should be very similar to the types of cases that you've read. So you're just making it up, okay? Are there any questions so far, Coleman, Misty? Does that sound okay to you all? Does it make sense? Misty, Coleman?
Sound great.
Sounds good?
Yeah.
Great, awesome, very cool. Thank you so much. Okay, so that's kind of like the framework for the case, right? So at the end of this week, you should have drafted that page, right, for the case presentation. And again, you're making it up. So there shouldn't be any citations or references, because this is something that you're making up, right? The only time there should be a citation or reference for something like this is you are defining the fraud. okay, it was a credit card fraud. Here's what credit card fraud is. Here's the citation. There's the reference, right? But that, other than that, I mean, there shouldn't be any citations or references except for when you're defining something, right? And it should be, of course, in your own words. So for this, I'm only looking for a page in length, a couple of paragraphs. It should be a full page, though. Make sure there should not be any bullet points. There should be like a straight up paper, right? Should be logical and flow. So to get an idea of how it should flow, just go ahead and review some of the cases that you've read already, or find some new ones on the FBI white collar list, and just kind of like read through it, right? And you know how it flows. At the top, there's usually a summary, and then the body text. This is the date and time of the crime. This is the type of fraud that was committed. This is who perpetrated the fraud. This is what happened, right? You're outlining what happened. And again, it should be fictitious. So get creative with it. Be as creative as you want to be, and as detailed as you want to be. Make this fun. Make it a fun type of creative thing to do, right? Okay, so again, the case development, use an existing case to create your own case. Follow that same flow, that same format. What is the setting of the case? So the setting, again, in my example I used was a gas station. It could be a bank. It could be somebody's home computer. It could be a warehouse. Whatever. Where's the set? What is the setting? What was the type of fraud committed? In my example I gave, it was credit card skimming. In your example, it might be physical theft of inventory. It might be, buying and selling of loans for property that never existed. Whatever it is. But tell me what is the type of fraud that was committed. What were the fraud controls that were violated? This is an interesting one. So think about COSO. Think about the type of controls that are in place to prevent fraud. How did the fraudster or the person committing the fraud circumvent the controls that were in place to prevent the fraud in the first place? For example, in my example of the gas station, the gas pumps are fitted with high-tech devices to prevent a skimmer from being put into place. But we know it still happens. So how did they circumvent that type of security? There's also cameras that face the gas pumps. How did the fraudster circumvent that? So how did they get around any control mechanisms that may have been in place to prevent the fraud in the first place? And be creative with this process. This should be kind of fun, right? You want to make it as fun and as entertaining as possible. But make sure it sounds real. It should sound realistic, right? It should sound realistic, but it should also be creative and kind of fun. Okay, so that's the case presentation, and that's due at the end of this week. So within the next 6 days, you should be typing and finishing this. Again, only 1 page in length, single spaced. Okay, the following week is a PowerPoint peer review process. So as you are working on developing your case presentation, you should be creating a couple of PowerPoint slides. The PowerPoint slides, looking at your PowerPoint presentation, again, this is found in the syllabus area. You should be developing a slideshow presentation, providing general information. This is about the COSO framework for your project. You're basically going through the timeline. And then, of course, you're going through this process. for this PowerPoint presentation, and the presentation should cover the entire project. Now, obviously, at the end of week 6, you're not going to have the entire project totally done, but it'll be mostly done, right? It's a draft version. And so the PowerPoint presentation really should cover your case presentation, your investigative project design, and the deterrence measure design. Since it's at the end of week 6, and these other 2 components are also due week 6, I think that the PowerPoint presentation that your colleagues are going to be reviewing, it's going to be a draft version. But use the COSO framework in that process. And don't worry, we'll talk about COSO framework. So the second part of this project, again, also due end of week 6, is the investigative project design. This is the investigation, right? So as you know, with every case, there's an investigation that takes place. This is where the CFE comes into play, okay? This is the certified fraud examiner, okay? So the CFE. The CFE comes in and they begin the process of looking at your case. This is the case that you developed, right? In this process, you're going to assume the role of CFE. You are going to analyze your own case that you developed, okay? Because remember, the case presentation, you created the scene, you created the fraud, you created the everything that happened, who was involved. So you know all the facts of the case, but now you are going to assume the role of the investigator. So how do we conduct an investigation? We go through the steps, right? So you as the investigator, you're going to go through the steps of investigation, to conduct interviews with individuals, with individuals, who is involved. You're going to interview your suspects. You're going to interview anyone who may have witnessed this fraud, and anyone who was a victim of this fraud. So you'll assume that you have some leads. You are going to take specific actions through the investigation process. What was the situation? What documents are necessary to conduct the interviews? What documentation can you find to support the facts in the case? And again, it should be fun, okay? So this will be another about a page or 2 in length. You want to be as detailed as you possibly can in your investigation. You want to follow a step-by-step process for conducting your investigation. You want to, in this part of the project, as you're typing this part of the report up, you want to identify the steps that you took in the investigation process. So what does that mean? Okay, so if we look, actually at the next slide. If we look at the next slide, what are the steps that we took? Okay, we identified the improper conduct. We identified the people responsible. We try to figure out how to stop the fraud. All of these items, right? So there are steps for investigating this type of activity. So let's talk a little bit more about those steps. So in the investigation process, what are the steps? So if we go back to week 5 and we take a look at, let's take a look at week 6. We take a look at our reading list for week 6. This one's good. This first article here is super helpful. Oh, well, it was super helpful. Something must have happened there. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So actually, was this, oh, this is the older version. So take a look at the one that I provided earlier. Let's take a look at this one. This is the same version, it's just newer, right? So take a look at this document, planning and conducting fraud examination. We want to identify the steps that we're taking in the investigation process. So what are the steps of investigation, right? So if we come down, and you'll have to do a little bit of reading here, but take a look at the theory to approach. Okay, here we go. What do we need to do in the investigation process? We need to analyze the available data, create a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and refine the amending hypothesis. So what does all that mean? In the example that I gave earlier with the gas station, the available data is the credit card transactions that took place at that gas pump between the dates that we suspect the fraud occurred, or between the dates that we suspect that the credit card skimmer was installed in the machine, okay? Which might be a month, couple of days, a week, whatever. But we want to analyze all of that credit card data that went through that gas pump during that time frame. That's the available data that we have. Then we create the hypothesis. Oh, the thief must have put the credit card skimmer on this particular date at this particular time. We're going to test that hypothesis by looking at the transactions of those individual credit cards during that particular time frame. That's how we test that hypothesis. Then we refine it, right? So if you read through this this document, this 2020 Fraud Examiner's Manual, there's a nice case study here that also identifies that process, right? So it talks about analyzing the available data, creating the hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, and then refining. So this is really the essential components of developing theory, right? So please definitely read through that. I think it'll be super important as you are writing your investigation component. Coleman, are we good so far? Misty?
Yes, sir.
You're still good? Okay. Well, at least I haven't bored you guys to death yet, because I mean, this is, well, I mean, I think it's kind of fun, right? It's not too boring, but it's definitely interesting, to say the least. The point behind this part of the process, oh, good. The point behind the investigation component of the process is to really teach you the process of investigation, right? It's like we all know what it's like to do research, because you've already done that through your first two current events reports, right? Well, that's fun, you know, because you get to read about what the case, and you get to analyze it, and you get to write your opinion. That's kind of cool, right? But now we get to make it more interesting by putting you in the driver's seat, okay? So you're the one that's writing the case. You're the one that is investigating that case, okay? And in that investigation process, it's all about understanding the steps that you need to take to investigate, right? And that's what a CFE does. A CFE, a certified fraud examiner, they follow the same protocol, the same steps, and in every investigation, they walk through the investigation process. And how do they do that? Well, they use this manual. They go through this CFE manual, this fraud examiner's manual, okay? And this manual really is, this is the framework, right, of how they go through this process of examining and investigating fraud. And so it's very important that this manual is used as it's intended. So please do use this manual as you are going through your process, and please do read it. It's definitely very good stuff, especially if you're planning on getting into this field from a professional perspective. I think you'll find it to be very helpful. Okay, so that's the manual. That's the investigative project design. Any questions so far, or are we okay? Again, that's the end of week 6. Okay, great. Thank you, Misty. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's go on to the third part of your paper, of your project. This is deterrence. So we talked about how the case is developed. We talked about how the case is investigated. Now let's talk about how do we deter that type of fraud from happening again, right? And how do we measure that deterrence? So deterrence is equally as important as the fraud itself. How do we prevent the fraud from happening again, right? How do we, goes back to the good old saying, how do we learn from our mistakes, right? And so how do we do that? So in your project, the third part of the project, also due at the end of week 6, is after the investigation is complete, what would you recommend that the enterprise or the business that was involved in that fraud, what do you recommend they do to prevent it from happening again? Okay. So for example, going back to the example I gave with the gas station, I would go to ExxonMobil or whoever the gas station owner is and say, hey, listen, in order to prevent this type of fraud from happening again, the pumps should be redesigned with a different type of reader for the credit card, right? And they should be updated and retrofitted. They should be tamper-proof. What do I mean by tamper-proof? Now, if you look at gas station pumps, you see this little sticker, okay? This little sticker that goes across the door where the printer is and where the computer part is of the gas pump, okay? And that sticker has little writing on it, and it says, do not use if this is tampered with, right? And so that is something that came about because that type of fraud happened, right? And so that would be recommendations I would give to that particular gas station to deter that type of fraud from happening again. And so think about that as you're writing the deterrence measure, right? What would you recommend that the business that this happened to prevent that from happening again? So as you're writing this project, this report, think of it with the end in mind. Okay, what do I mean by that? When I'm writing a report, the first thing I think about is not the beginning of the report. I think about the end of the report. The end of the report is more important than what actually happens. What do I mean? When I write something, when I write an article or I write a report, the first thing I think about is what are my readers going to try, what do they need to get out of this? What is the most important part about this that they need to get out of it? What inferences can they draw from this, okay? And so when I write something, I think about the end in mind. Right? I'm thinking about, okay, so at the end of this report, after somebody reads it, what do they want to get out of that? Okay, what is the call to action? What is the reason why they're reading this in the first place? Okay. So before you select or before you create your fictitious scenario of the fraud, I want you to think about how it will be deterred, right? What will you recommend for that deterrence? What will you tell the company to implement in order to deter that from happening again? So don't make it too complex because you might not have a good answer for that. All right. So like if you're like, oh, this guy perpetrated a bank loan fraud where, and this does happen, the bank issued a mortgage on a property that doesn't exist. It's like, oh, here's an address. The address is a field. There is no house on it. But somebody took out a mortgage on a property that they said is there. The bank didn't do their due diligence to find out if the property was actually there. Okay? And that does happen. That happens quite frequently. So what do you recommend? What would be the deterrence measure that you would give to that bank? Stop doing that? No, that doesn't work. It's a complex matter. Will you send out tell the bank, you should send out a home examiner before issuing the mortgage. You should do a background check on the people requesting the mortgage. You should examine any other evidence that property actually exists, right? Whether it be through satellite images or through, or you should approach the municipality to validate that the property is there, right? That type of stuff. That will be the measures I'll provide to the bank. So when I understand what the measure is, then I should start writing my scenario, right? So again, almost think of it like a reverse, because the reality is you want to make sure that all three steps or all three parts of this project are all, they flow well. They got to flow well together, yeah? So don't make it too complex, because the more complex it becomes, the more difficult it'll be for you to write it, okay? The idea is that you want to make everything cohesive. You know what the measure is, and you have an idea of how they can deter it, right, from happening again. Then go write your scenario. Write your scenario. This is what happened. This is who was involved. This is the date and time that it happened. All those fun details. You write the whole wonderful long page of fun information about the case. And then you go into your investigation. Oh, this is, what the investigation details. These are the steps we took for the investigation. These are the conclusions. This is what should happen, right? It should be that detailed. And then, of course, the deterrence component. These are the recommendations I gave to the company on how to deter it. These are the steps that should be taken. This is what you recommend, right? That should be about a page as well, about a page in length. So really, we're looking at, probably 4 to 5 pages for a really good report. And this is a full report. This is all 3 parts of the project. The full report should be about 4 to 5 pages total. Are we good so far? Hopefully this makes a whole ton of sense and that it's very clear. Yep, great, wonderful. Thank you, Coleman. Thank you, Misty. Okay. Okay, now here's a fun part. Let's talk a little bit more about deterrence. As you know, data analytics is huge. It's a huge thing right now. This is called big data or data mining. These are all phrases that are commonly used now. So I want you to think about it from a data perspective. and this will help you to provide deterrence guidance to the company that the fraud happened to. So if going back to my example with the gas station, with the gas pump, if you think about the data that we gathered in the investigation process, we're looking at credit card data. It's a whole ton of data involved, right? There's probably thousands of people that use that gas pump in one day, right? If it's a busy area. And so there's thousands of potential frauds that could have been committed by that data being sold on the internet. So what do we need to do? We need to analyze the data, right? And so we call that data analytics. And so this is a really good website. I found it's a blog, right? It's not anything too exciting. But this is a really good article that I found that I thought was really relevant because it ties back. Of course, it ties back to the CFE. But I want you to understand how data analytics works, right? We gather the raw data, the credit card transactions, how much each transaction was. We start doing some digging. Where was a credit card swiped? How many times? Who swiped it? All that good stuff, right? And we could get all of that data just from looking at the transactions. And you know that. All of you are accounting majors or an area within accounting. And from your understanding of transactions, you know that there's data behind that transaction. You know that there's a debit and a credit somewhere, right? You know that there was a debit made to one account and a credit made to another account. So there's data, right? There's some data there. And we know that there was a dollar amount tied to those debits and credits. So we then pull that data out of a subset of a larger piece of data and analyze it. We look at the details of the information of that data. And we try to put together the pieces of the puzzle. The data tells a story, okay? So it's like, the reason why I personally like accounting is because I like the story behind the numbers, okay? Numbers to me are boring. They're just numbers. They don't do much for me. But what I like about it is that there's a story behind those numbers. There is a reason why those numbers appear. Something happened, and to me that's interesting, and that's why I personally like accounting. The same could be said with data analytics. We're pulling data out to tell the story of what happened. In this case, I'm pulling a series of transactions that happened at a gas pump to tell a story of a fraud that was perpetrated, right? And so that's why data mining is so critical, or data analytics is so critical to this type of analysis. So go ahead and read through that. I think it's a really interesting article. And it'll help you to put together a deterrence component. So when you're given the recommendation for deterrence, you're saying, okay, well, here's the data that we gathered. Here's how we were able to piece this puzzle together based off of the data that we found. Here's what we recommend you do to prevent it from happening again in the future, right? And that's how it all comes together. Are we good so far? Yep. Okay, great. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so that's that part. Let's talk a little bit more about some other pieces of information I think will be helpful for you. Okay, detection and deterrence planning. How do we detect fraud in the first place? Well, we identify anomalies. We identify anomalies in the data. When something looks out of place, there may have been a fraud that was committed. When we identify something that just doesn't seem right, there may have been a fraud in that case. We use predictors to identify fraud based off of actions that have happened in the past. And so take a look at the Statistical Analysis and Data Mining Applications Handbook. That is another interesting area of interest to kind of get an idea of how to detect fraud. How do we deter fraud? We identify what has happened. We attempt to take an approach to prohibit it from happening again. And we implement internal controls to reduce that risk of it happening again. This is a concept of COSO, and this is in the Handbook of Fraud Deterrence. What is a fraud triangle? A fraud triangle, these are causal factors that should have been removed to deter fraud, as best described in the fraud triangle. This is the idea that there was a motive, rationalization, and opportunity to commit fraud. What is the motive? This is the need to commit fraud or the pressure. You know, why was it done? Why did somebody put a skimmer in a gas station pump? What's the motive? Why would they do that? Well, clearly to get some money. But why? But why? What caused that to happen? What in the person's mind? Why would they do that? What is the motive? What is the rationalization? What's the mindset that justifies it as being the thing to do? You don't just wake up one day and say, hey, listen, I'm going to put a credit card skimmer into a gas pump. No, people don't think this way. This is not rational. The rationalization behind committing such a fraud comes in place where I'm doing it to get back at the corporation. I'm doing it because this is a means for me to get by, whatever it is, okay? Every time a crime is committed, there's a rationalization that the criminal made in their mind to make it justified. What is the opportunity? What is the situation that enabled them to do it in the first place? What weakness existed? And the gas station pump concept, the opportunity was there was no camera pointed directly at the pump, so nobody saw them. The gas station attendant was busy and was distracted at the time. The criminal used a ski mask. The criminal hid their face through some other means. The gas station pump was out of date, so therefore there were many weaknesses at the pump itself. So that was the opportunity, right? So motive, rationalization, opportunity. These are the three components to every fraud that's perpetrated that helps the criminal in this aspect to understand why the fraud is being committed in the first place. So as you are writing that first part of your project, or even in the investigation part, what is the motive? What is the rationalization? What was the opportunity? Those are three areas that you will definitely, I recommend that you include in your investigation. Let's look at the COSO model. This helps us in the fraud deterrence when it comes to identifying the opportunity within COSO. So here are the 5 components of COSO in the framework. Control your environment, assess your risk, control activities within the environment, information and communication, and monitoring. These 5 components of the COSO framework help us to deter fraud, right? And prevent it. And so the COSO model, as you know, and it's in your classroom. Please take a look at it. I would encourage that you identify the COSO model in the third part of your project. Okay, so in the planning process, how do we deter fraud? How do we plan to deter fraud, right? How do we plan to deter it? When you put together a plan, you need to identify what the problem is. What was the type of fraud? What's the situation? What's the cause of fraud? Identify what the problem is. Develop a framework for detecting fraud. How do I detect it? Is it through computer database anomalies? Is it through human behavior anomalies? Is it through some type of trend or pattern that's happening in the area? How are we going to detect it? And then what's the framework for deterring it? You look at COSO, you see how COSO developed the framework for deterrence. How do we deter it, right? Create the framework for deterrence. And then what tools are you going to use? Are you going to use computers? Are you going to use human analysis? Are you going to use some other metrics? Are you going to use data mining? What are you going to use in order to conduct your plan, right? So that's it. Are there any comments, questions, concerns? What were your thoughts on the presentation? Do you think this will help you? Anything at all? Comlin, Misty?
Hello, sir. It was a great and helpful presentation. It gave me more insight on what I have to write and how to formulate my case by myself. I was thinking about that since the third week, last week. I can say I was thinking about how am I going to formulate the case by giving us some broad idea about it. I know exactly what I'm going to write. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, Misty, for your comments. I'm glad that was helpful. The next session we'll have is going to be on the 30th of this month, end of the month. That is 2 weeks from today. We will cover the last 2 weeks of the course in our last session. So, okay, well, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me. You can or make some comments through the discussion forum. Either way, I am here to help. And I thank you for attending and for viewing this session. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.